What tips do you have for players who want to roleplay their familiars better or more often? And what if they ask you as the DM to do it for them, to you be the familiar, like it's just another NPC you're running?
This brings back one kind of declarative statement, is that the players should never ask the GM to do their job. DMs or GMs have their own problem. They're dealing with a half a dozen creatures. They don't have time to deal with your BS. If you want to have a familiar, that's your responsibility. It's not mine as a GM. If you want to bring that, you go, can you roleplay him? No, I'm not doing any of that crap. I got 45 NPCs to deal with. You can deal with your own crap. So yeah, absolutely not. The GM should not be responsible for handling that. However, some players, if they are left to their own devices, they'll never imbue their familiar with personality because it feels like they're playing two people. So in this situation, there have been times where I have, but that's because I've wanted to, because I wanted to annoy the player by having their familiar do something weird, or have the familiar volunteer something that was like, how can I exposit some dialogue? Okay, maybe I'll have like the Crow from the Sandman show, the TV series, have it just squirt in some annoying dialogue and go, hey, he's your familiar, you got to deal with that crap. If you're in a situation where the player group is cohesive, like it's a group that's been together for a long time, they're all friends, maybe have one of the other players role play your familiar for you. Then they get a little bit of a personality boost, and the DM/GM is absolved from having to take on that responsibility. Because in my experience, whenever a player has to run their own, they never imbue any personality in their familiar. It's only when an external party does so that we start to see that personality come through. The GM should not have to do that unless they want to annoy their players, which I'm always open for. As an alternative, maybe get another player to do it for you. Or if there's somebody at the table that's actually not in the game, like, you know, you got a party and let's say my wife who doesn't always roleplay, I go, honey, can you play the dog? Sit down, can you play this dog for a little bit? That's all you're doing. Just play the dog. You know, there's just alternatives, but trying to keep that ownership away from the GM.
Some DMs, they think the familiar is on them, but it doesn't have to be. If they don't want to do that, say no, like that, this is your thing, player. A good compromise is to give some NPCs or NPC-like characters to the players. Like I once ran a big group where they did get a few followers, and I was like, kind of don't want to like metagame through that NPC by accident or do something that you wouldn't want them to do. So I just say, you have to handle them because I don't want to be blamed if they do something you don't like, and stuff like that. The same thing could go for a familiar, you know, give someone else in the party, like, especially because like sometimes if you're role-playing with your familiar, it's easier to have someone else in the party do that because they're probably not busy while you're trying to do that.
I'm open to role-playing familiars on the behalf of a player, but there is a very specific distinction of very specific things I require for this. I will role-play your familiar. I will not control your familiar, like especially when it comes to combat. It's like, nope, that's back to you. I will do the fun little quirky things when we have interactions, but when it comes to combat, if they die, that's on you. To get me to roleplay it, we gotta flesh it out. You know, I need to know what kind of pet do you have? What kind of familiar, what kind of relationship do you have with this thing? I will ask to collaborate with the player to flesh them out. Firstly, I want to make it true to the vision of the player, who, if I'm roleplaying it, they probably don't even have a vision at the first point. Otherwise, they'd be roleplaying it themselves. Definitely, you know, give it a name, give it some sort of unique visual quirk so we don't confuse it with the other animals we run across. I think ways to kind of make it so, because I agree in that a lot of the time we'll forget about familiars, we'll forget about pets. If we really cement them as a member of the adventuring party, it becomes a lot more difficult to forget that they're part of the team. Consider what is their relationship to not only their associated spellcaster, but how do they get along with the other members of the party, you know? Does it have history with any other players? If the spellcaster has history with them, give it moments of character interaction and see what happens. Does it like to play? What does that look like? Does it try and sneak extra food by going to one of the other characters? You know, these are fun, quirky things and situations that can help the familiar feel like it's got personality. Encourage the other party members to interact with the familiar, you know, get them starting on interactions with the familiar, you know, hey, is the dog around? I want to rub its belly. Maybe at that point, the player who controls the dog is like, oh no, he doesn't like that because of this one time I rubbed his belly and accidentally shocking grasped at the same time. So a bit of a Pavlovian response, which is hilarious because we're using a dog in this example. I had one campaign where both facets of this familiar issue came up. I had one player who created an owl, which already made no sense for the story because it was an underground setting for like hundreds of years. They gave it a very complicated name and we totally forgot about it. It just had no personality. We never used it. And then another player came along and he created Spike the Almirage, who he's like, this is my investigative partner. I will use him in when we go into sites and, he'll help me find clues and stuff. And he has the ability to talk. So I was like, yeah, we'll give him a bit of a bugs thing, I mean, the fact it could talk really helped as well, but it felt like one familiar was much more memorable than the other.
It's funny, you mentioned that oftentimes players just forget they have them. Like, they could love pets and love their familiar, but they just forget about them. I think the most famous example is Laura Bailey with her bear Trinket in Critical Role. She'd always forget about it, but Sam would always remind her, like, when they get blown up, he'd be like, hey, did Trinket get blown up too? And she'd be like, wait, no, Trinket's here, And so, like, they end up doing the thing, just like they made Trinket basically a familiar, where if he dies, like, he just, like, goes into a little Pokeball sort of thing. You should find ways to remind them that they have familiars. I thought one way might be kind of fun is to give them a little plushie that represents it. So when they're playing, they like literally hold something that tells them they have a familiar.
I'm going to hop off of what Denny said a lot. Foot down about the familiars in combat. I am not going to run those for you. I already have, 5 enemies to take care of. I already have enough trouble trying to remember to roll initiative for the NPCs that are with the party. You take care of your own familiar. As far as outside of combat, though, I am definitely okay with helping the role-playing process along for that. In one of the campaigns I'm actually playing in, what we do is one of the players is a Pact of the Chain warlock. So he has an imp familiar who is intelligent and can talk. Everybody at the table role-plays him as like weird comedic relief jokes. If they think of a joke or something funny, they can pipe up as Percy is the familiar's name and say, Percy said this. Also going off of what Denny said, the best thing about the Find Familiar spell is that they can disappear, so you don't always have to keep track of them. That is just super convenient. Another Critical Role example with Sprinkle. Like, they were underwater for hours. Is Sprinkle still alive? Can he hold his breath for 3 hours like the rest of them? Do you have enough spell slots to get Sprinkle in that control and that underwater breathing spell? But familiars, you can just like delete them for a bit and then copy paste them back into existence. Usually, I think the best way to use familiars, if I get to run them, is to have enemies target the familiars. And if they care about them, the players freak out and they suddenly just despise, they abhor this enemy for killing their beloved whatever, their spider or something. Maybe it's a bit evil of me, but it's a really fun way to just manipulate player feelings about your villains.
The John Wick effect.
Yes, exactly.
I'm going to take your question backwards as far as would I mind role-playing the familiar? And of course that is, I would rather not. I like to make the distinction between familiars versus like animal companions versus pets. If you have an animal with you, such as a familiar, or like if you're playing a Drake Warden Ranger, you've got your Drake or your Steel Defender, that's your backstory, that's your relationship with that creature. You as a player are going to know what that creature does, what its likes and dislikes are and things of that nature. Now a pet, on the other hand, that is something that I would like to control more or less as an NPC, but a pet. So like if you find like a baby owlbear and start to raise it, that's something I'm going to control because that gives me kind of an outlet to baby owlbear going to go get in trouble, kind of a thing. You picked it up, this is what's going to happen. I don't want to role play your familiar. If you really insist on it, I will. We'll have to have a talk and figure out things, but I would rather you take care of that. Now I will remind them that they have their familiar, because if I don't remind them about it and they don't tell me where their familiar is, then all of a sudden everybody's been captured. They're in this cell. There's some keys on the wall. Like, oh yeah, I got my rat familiar. I'll just have him go over there and get it. It's like, oh, that's convenient. Your rat familiar is there all of a sudden. But it wasn't there when the whole party got fireballed and went unconscious. With familiars, though, they can always resummon them. As a DM, you shouldn't be afraid to torture. Of course, like it's been stated, they're going to get a little bit angry. But a pet usually doesn't come back, where a familiar can come back. Here I am. My next part, as far as recommending how to role play your familiars, is talk to it. Give it a personality. If you got a rat that sits on your shoulder and you are engaging in role play or whatever else, like, what do you think of that, buddy? Should we trust him? Include that as part of your character. This familiar is now an extension of you. Include that in there. Like, hey, come out and tell me what you think of this. And swipe a piece of cheese for it. Like, hey, I see a piece of cheese, but I'm going to try to swipe it, and make it an extension of your character. It's it's an extended personality.
I'm going to disagree a little bit with some of the other people here. For one thing, whenever we play, because I 3D print, I will print, you probably can't see it, but I will print whatever the familiar, there's a little dinosaur, I will print up whatever the person's familiar is, so they'll never forget about it because it's next to their miniature on the table. It's never forgotten. It's always with the party as they move through. Whether on an overland map or on dungeon tiles or whatever we're using, because we always play in 3D. So the familiar or the pet is always there. The more intelligent that pet or familiar is, the more likely I am to roleplay it for them. When the player's supposed to be in control of it, I'm never in control, right? So when a player's focused on their familiar or their pet and ordering it to do something, that's on them. I'm not in control. As soon as they're not controlling it, I'm controlling it. I might not do anything for half an adventure, but I'm going to take control of it at a certain time when they're not, and make something fun happen, because again, the game's all about fun. I actually don't like a player role-playing their familiar. They're playing their character. I don't want them to play the character they're interacting with. Again, that to me, that's like playing two characters. Unless you're supposed to be embodied in that familiar, I don't want them to do it. It's just an extra thing that's there, and when it needs to act on its own, I'm going to do that. When they're in control, they're in control. So there's no need to actually role-play, in my opinion. I don't think it adds anything to the game. Maybe there's some type of player out there that I haven't met yet that would be more fun for them to also role play their familiar or pet. If that was the case, then I would just allow it, because again, I'm trying to maximize the fun for my players, not go by any set rules that's going to minimize the fun, right? In all the parties I've ever ran, I don't think I've had anyone who really actively wanted to role play their familiar. They want to interact with them, and then it's better if they want to interact with their familiar. It's actually better for me to role play it. So I normally will role play it when that time comes. It's a great way to advance the plot. If the players aren't advancing it, you can use the familiar or the pet to do something goofy and funny and advance your plot at the same time, and it just makes them that more integral to the whole story if they kick off a chain of events, right? So I do think it allows us some plot freedom to use those things when they're not focused on them.
My first advice to players who are role-playing a familiar is don't get it killed too often, because if you get it killed too often, you can't really role-play with it. It's very difficult to role-play a familiar if it's constantly dying. That being said, as a dungeon master at my table, all pets, animal companions, and familiars are at the top of my priority for killing first over the player characters. I have no qualms about that, okay? That is how it is. Just make sure you have your materials ready to resummon it again, because it's a familiar. If you don't have that, what were you doing? You should have had that 10 gold set aside with the materials to do that. You got to just do something with it. Like, I think the primary problem with a familiar in the games where I've played is when people try to do something with the familiar and role play with it, and it's an interaction between their character and the familiar ultimately. It works best when it's a cog to the party. It doesn't have to have a combat function to it, but it has to have something that's integral and useful in terms of the party as a whole. When I say as a part of the cog or machine, I don't necessarily mean it's all going to be mechanical. Okay, that's not what I mean, because there are other aspects to the game other than just the dice rolling aspect of it, right? My advice is you've got to do it, because I'm not going to do it as a dungeon master. I have no intentions of role playing somebody else's familiar. The other thing that I found when people are trying to role play with their familiar is you got to be careful about what you do with it. Don't annoy the dungeon master as it is, because as a dungeon master for me, your familiar is already prime target as it is. So don't make it worse so that I actually create more situations where I will kill it again. Don't actually piss off the other players with your familiar. When you decide to do something with it and you're taking so much time at the table away from everybody else because of that familiar interaction, there's a problem. You've got to make it so that it actually ties in with the party, I think. So I'm going to suggest that you consider using your familiar as sort of like a servant or assistant in campsite duties. So when somebody's going to do the cooking, then this is the time when the familiar goes and helps whoever's got the chef's feet. It's a stupid feat, that, by the way. And who's doing the cooking, and like that familiar goes and gets all the ingredients, like whips off and gets the herbs from and then brings them back, in its teeth, and then drops it down so they can then put it into the soup or the stew or whatever it is. Assist with the campsite duties or the cooking. And if you've got a stronghold and you get like a newspaper delivered, make sure the familiar is the one who runs out there or flies out there, grabs the newspaper, brings it back, dumps it on somebody's lap. Might be your lap, might be somebody else's. I know you're thinking, Fred, I've never put newspaper delivery into my game. What the hell are you talking about? I totally get it. I am kind of pulling a leg a little bit. I had to come up with something because my section was, the only thing I had was just kill it. Oh no, hang on, don't get it killed too often. So I've been writing desperately Wally here. The other thing, because as I was listening to people who were talking about, like, what do you do? Players forget all the time, because this has happened to me. And I was looking at Greg and I was like, 3D printing pro. I bet you Greg prints out miniatures. Make sure you got a miniature for the thing so they can't forget. When Greg said that, I was like, perfect. I'm glad he went first. And then I guess the last thing I'm going to say is, like, if you've got a familiar and the idea of having the familiar is often to cast a spell through it, right? Like, try to find ritual spells or utility spells that are cast through the familiar that go and assist somebody else in a task. I don't really care what it is. It doesn't have to be in combat. In fact, it's probably better if it's not, because taking familiars into combat is just a prime excuse for Fred, the dungeon master, to fireball it. But outside of combat, put it through the familiar rather than your character, so that the other players feel like it's actually like a useful addition to the party. Then that it will inspire them to interact. Then you've got an opportunity to have an interplay between your two players, and the dungeon master can sit back and do as little as possible, which is, I think, a better idea.
Kind of brought up a plushie. I don't know why I didn't think of a miniature first. Yeah, having that physical representation is great. If you have your players do recaps, you could have them do it like in a simplistic version of like the perception of the familiar of how things have occurred. Like, Master did this. That could be a fun thing if people are into that. Also, just when you passively are doing things, this kind of feeds into like what Fred was saying, like the camp chores. When you're doing something, even if like your familiar isn't necessary to do it, describe yourself doing it with the familiar. Casting a spell, have a hand reach out of your robe with the components you need seamlessly as you cast the spell. Or when you're falling off a cliff and your wizard hat is falling off of you, your familiar, describe your familiar being under the hat on your head and like grabbing the hat to keep it on your head as you're falling. Or when you cast Firebolt on the edge of your arm, have your familiar there also doing like the same hand motion you are, so it's like you're both casting Firebolt. When you're doing an Arcana check and you roll well enough, but you're like not sure how to describe it, you're just like, oh, what is this? And then all of a sudden a note from your familiar, like from so long ago, this note you had from your studies is handed to you. Oh yeah, thanks. I know what this is. That could be a great way to do it as well. So lots of fun ways to roleplay it that just could be passive, whether you're failing or succeeded, or just passively doing something that's not really like fail or not. Tell your DM if, like, some people really don't like animals getting hurt in their game. So if you want to have pets, a familiar or anything, talk to your DM to see if they're going to fretify it and just try to kill it all the time. If they are, learn Death Ward as soon as possible and always put Death Ward on your familiar, and that will help a lot.
I don't like Pokemon, but Pokeballs. Pokeballs, the single most useful thing to secure your familiar so that it is in a safe location, so it doesn't get decimated by area effect spells and killer DMs. Is you got to get it in there as quickly as possible.
The other thing I'd like to throw out, even though it's maybe only tangential to the conversation, is giving a player a familiar or a pet that might not normally have one. Like in one of the parties I just had a player who loved dogs. Dogs are like his favorite thing. So I just had them find in treasure a figurine that summoned a type of dog that he liked, and that way he had the pet dog with him just because it made him happy. Didn't really function much in game. For some people, having that pet or that familiar adds to the game for them, so it's something to consider. If you find out you have a player who just wants something, find a way to give it to them if it makes them happy.
Plus, there are rules you could employ if you have a non-magical animal. It's just like, oh my god, there's a fireball. Well, if you suffer disadvantage, you can carry your animal outside the blast radius. Your dog failed it. Do you want to fail it as well and take all the damage so your dog doesn't?
You shield it. Right, you shield the animal. Exactly.
Yeah. It's a great way of inflicting more damage on your players by having them protect their dog.
For some people, that enhances the game, so you just roll with it.
Exactly.
I wanted to go off of what you were saying, Jordan, about checking with your players, making sure animal harm is okay. It is a game killer when you cross that kind of boundary and it wasn't okay with the player. If it was like a trigger warning, that's a big one. Talk with your players about whether this sort of theme is okay. If they say yes, then go ahead, fretify it, like you said. I was doing this to one of my players who keeps using his owl to say, no, my owl's going to do the perception checks because he has advantage and a +6 and he can fly 500 feet in the air and not get hit by anything, and he'll just tell me when something's approaching. I was trying to figure out a way to make it matter more when they die, because they can just 10 gold and a bit of incense and they're back. I've never tried this. I came up with this 5 minutes ago. Make it so that when a player's familiar dies, if they bring it back, they can never be in a form it's been in before, so that when that owl dies, now if you want want the familiar back, you need to choose a spider or a dog or something else so that it feels like when they die, they've lost something.
That might cramp a player's style. For me, I just make them wait 24 hours.
That's a good one.
So if it's exploring, and this is good, it's good like plot armor as a GM. If it's doing something you don't want to do, you just have it get killed, and then 24 hours to summon it back, and boom, you've taken care of the problem of the owl exploring the whole cave for them or whatever it is, or exploring the whole overland and destroying everything you've planned out. All you need is a murder of crows, attack the owl, boom, 24 hours to summon it back, you saved your adventure.
I don't do this with familiars. I do this with animal pets and animal companions, because one of the things that becomes very obvious when you're dealing with somebody who wants an animal is they're not taking into consideration, and they can't necessarily take into consideration ambushes. Like if you're dealing with an ambush situation, you've either got a sort of retro, okay, the animal companion wasn't actually near you at that time, but of course your character was completely unaware that they were being ambushed by hobgoblins controlled by Josiah. Probably the easiest way, and I found that worked really well for pets, and you may want to apply it to familiars, but I always felt like familiars weren't necessarily the actual animal, and it was better to think of a familiar as a spirit. So what I did is when a Beastmaster Ranger lost their animal, they I can re-get another animal, and they would say to me, but I really want the original animal that died. And I said, well, normally you don't use raised dead on a animal, but why not?
Sometimes if you want your pet to be more functional, like I used the idea of a little lost dog in Curse of Strahd named Lancelot. It's a commonly used community idea. Every time I've run Curse of Strahd, the players have taken in Lancelot, the little lost dog, and restored him to health and made him like an attack dog. And so I started using the Sidekick rules from Tasha's and just gave the martial version of that so he could actually be more formidable, or at least have a little bit more HP. Because those Sidekick rules, I actually quite like them for people who want to have a few NPCs that are usually very weak and they won't just get killed by the first blowgun that comes their way. I also realized in a world building sense, and I've seen this before, where if you encounter too many enemies who have a familiar, you start to suspect every animal is spying on you, and so it actually kind of breeds animal cruelty. Like the concept of a familiar makes people just probably be more hostile and violent towards animals just in case they're being spied on. Just from a world building perspective, that's sad, kind of funny.
That's the same reason I won't use a mimic in my games. Once you use a mimic, every single room my players go into, I stab the bed, I stab the chest, I stab the door. I'm like, okay, now when they walk into a room, I'm like, there's no mimics in here. You sense there are no mimics. Because once you use one, it's like game over. The mimic's the worst. I know it looks cool in drawings and whatever. It's the worst thing ever created.
I've always felt pretty similar, and I felt I had an unpopular opinion.
I think it would be a fantastic little side plot, and this would only work for a pet, or if there was some magical item reason. The familiar or pet is instead captured, and now you gotta get back. If you wanted to go, let's use that owl that we were using earlier as an example. If it was a familiar, maybe it's got to be some sort of magical cage that disallows it from conjuration magic to get to its other plane that it's stored in. So you lose this resource until you get that owl back.
You could even make it simple, maybe it's a silvered cage can contain a familiar or something like that, or even just an iron one if you want to feed into the whole
Fae kind of thing.
Fae stuff. Yeah, that could be a fun angle to take too if you
just reflavor dimensional shackles.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You can make dimensional shackles really easy to do for familiars, but then the greater version is the proper magic item.
The only thing I have to add is probably an unpopular one, and that is we were talking about people getting triggered by endangering an animal. In my experience as a GM, if you are triggered easily by that sort of thing, don't endanger your animal. If you are going to put your animal in harm's way, don't expect me to be the person that saves it. That's just my personal opinion on that. If you want to have a pet and you don't want to have it endangered to the risk of it being killed, don't put it in a situation where it can be. I'm not saying I'm going to do that, but I'm saying the fact that if you're easily triggered and then you're flippant about what the animal does, you're basically taunting the GM and daring them to do harm and get them angry. I'm in a situation is if you're going to put the animal in harm's way, then in my opinion, you're letting the animal take risks. Then you're taking risks, you have to have the possibility of its defeat.
Well, thanks everyone for joining our discussion about how to make unfamiliars become more familiar.